And we'll pick up where we left off with last week. Now, we were taking some time and looking at some of the miracles or some of the great works of God that Elisha was performing and had been performing up through his ministry and the influence that his ministry had as well. We got to 2 Kings chapter 4. We saw some of the things that he did. And we finished up last week looking at 2 Kings at chapter 5 with Naaman. And Naaman, of course, as we saw in the first verse here of chapter 5, a very important captain in the Syrian army that was a leper, and that was pretty much leprosy at this point of history, a little bit different than the Legionnaire's disease that we have now. This was essentially a death sentence for these people who had leprosy. It was just a matter of time. And we saw Naaman and then the little slave girl that Naaman's wife had brought in, who knew of Elisha, knew of the power that Elisha wielded through God, and told Naaman to go and find Elisha and that he would be able to help him with his leprosy. Okay? And we finished up last week with Naaman at first not wanting to listen to what Elisha said. Elisha told him to go down and to bathe himself 7 times in the Jordan River. And Naaman said, well, it's not one of these rivers that's much closer. You're going to do the same thing. Eventually, though, Naaman's servants and his people around him pretty much told him that he was being stubborn and being silly for not doing what Elisha said. He goes and he washes himself 7 times in the Jordan River. As we see down here, he is healed of his leprosy. Okay, and that's where we stopped this story at last week. All right, and that was about verses 13, 14, and 15 is kind of where we were at. And if you go down to verse 15, and we'll kind of pick back up where we left off with last week. Now, you think this is the end of the story. Naaman comes to his senses. He goes and washes himself. He's healed of his leprosy. He goes back and all things. He finds Elisha and they hug and they talk about how great God is. Well, that's not the case here. There's a little bit more to this story that we're going to look at. All right, so let's go to verse 15 of chapter 5. And again in verse 14 has just washed himself and been cleansed of his leprosy. So in verse 15, and he returned to the man of God, he and all of his company, and came, and stood before him and said, Behold now, I know that there is no God in all the earth but in Israel. Now therefore I pray thee, take a blessing of thy servant. But he said, As the Lord liveth before whom I stand, I will receive none. And he urged him to take it, but he refused. Okay, so now that Naaman has been healed of his leprosy, what does he want to do for Elisha? Wants to reward him in some way, right? Wants to pay him or give him a reward in some way because he has been healed of his leprosy. Now, Naaman shows up, tells Elisha, God is the God of Israel, is the only God that is worthy of sacrifice. He's the only God, the only true God in all the world is the one that is the God of Israel. And Naaman here is preparing and would have rewarded Elisha probably more than anything Elisha probably could imagine. Right? He would have given him about what he wanted and probably even. But Elisha, as we see in verse 16, refuses the gifts. Refuses the rewards, and desiring only that Naaman acknowledge the fact that God was the true God and that there was a true prophet of God living in Israel. So what did Elisha hear? Right? So what Elisha is now communicating some stuff to Naaman, explaining the power of God, showing the power of God, but he goes one step further. And kind of teaching Naaman a lesson here. What else is Elisha communicating to Naaman about his faith in God by refusing the payment or the reward? What's the next step of the lesson here that Elisha is teaching Naaman by not taking his reward? Exactly, right? So God has provided for Naaman, God has provided for Elisha for so long, and God is going to continue to provide for Elisha. Naaman probably could have made Elisha's life probably very easy, giving him what he wanted and probably never had to worry or want for anything ever again, essentially. But because of Elisha's refusal of that gift, he's teaching Naaman even further another lesson here, that he's reliant entirely and completely on God for his sustenance and for everything about life, right? Total reliance on God here. And Elisha did not want to affect Naaman's faith in any way by making it appear that he did this miracle for the reward from Naaman, right? He didn't want Naaman to think that he paid him handsomely and he did this miracle. That's not what the point he was trying to get across. He wanted to get across the point that this came directly because of his faith and his obedience to God. So that's why he said no to it. Now we get to verse 17 though, and then we see kind of Naaman's response to this. So we have Naaman washing himself here, and as we see, we get to verse 17, and we kind of see his now responding to Elisha, essentially saying no to his reward. And Naaman said, "Shall there not then, I pray thee, be given to thy servant 2 mules burden of earth? For thy servant will henceforth offer neither burnt offerings nor sacrifice unto other gods, but unto the Lord. And in this thing the Lord pardon thy servant, that when my master goeth into the house of Rimmon to worship there, and he leaneth on my hand, and I bow myself in the house of Rimmon, when I bow down myself in the house of Rimmon, the Lord pardon thy servant in this thing." So the response here to this is that Naaman responds by asking for a load or of the dirt of the earth to take back to Syria. So he asked for Elisha that he can take some of the dirt or the earth back to Syria. And the reason that he wanted a load of the dirt to take back is that he wanted to kneel on the Israelite earth or on the Israelite dirt as he worshipped in his master's pagan temple, right? The temple of Rimmon there he keeps talking about in verse 18. So he's wanting to take some of the dirt back and to worship in his master's pagan temple. Now, having this dirt of Israel, this Israelite earth, would indicate that his worship was to God and not to the false god Rimmon. Okay, and that's why he wanted to do that. Now, Naaman did not want to be punished by his master for worshiping the true God of Israel. And he wanted to appear to be worshiping the false god, but by actually worshiping God, that's why he wanted to take the earth back to him. So while his faith here, it's young, right? He's just now kind of realizing these things. His faith is young, and we kind of looking at this, thinks maybe that's kind of a silly thing to do. Got to remember and kind of applaud the fact that his desire to be true to God. He was trying to be true to God. Didn't really know how to do it yet, right? He's just going to learn those things. But he has a desire of taking the earth back to worshiping the true God. Now, so that's an interesting kind of what the response of Naaman kind of wanted what he wanted to do. And verse 19, we see he says, "And he said unto him, Go in peace. So he departed from him a little way." Okay, so we see Naaman now again. What we think maybe a kind of a silly way of doing it. Naaman should have been busting the pagan temple, right, and saying that he's not going to worship Rimmon anymore. He's going to be worshiping God, but he's trying to do the right things. And Elisha sees that and understands that, and kind of tells him to go about his way. Now that story still yet though doesn't end here. We get to verse 20, and we've seen Elisha's servant Gehazi before. He's been involved in some of the other things that Elisha has done. But Gehazi has a different idea about the wealth and the reward here that Naaman had just offered unto Elisha. Okay, he wanted some of the wealth and some of the stuff that Naaman had to offer. Verse 20. But Gehazi, the servant of Elisha, the man of God, said, Behold, my master hath spared Naaman this Syrian, in not receiving at his hand that which he brought. But, as the Lord liveth, I will run after him, and take somewhat of him. So Gehazi followed after Naaman, and when Naaman saw him running after him, he lighted down from the chariot to meet him, and said, Is all well? And he said, All is well. My master hath sent me, saying, Behold, even now there be come to me from the mount of Ephraim 2 young men, the sons of the prophets. Give them, I pray thee, a talent of silver and 2 changes of garments. So, what does Gehazi do here? Runs down Naaman and says what? Elisha sent me to tell you that I need some of that reward. Right? I need a little bit of that gold, a little bit of that silver. He didn't want to say it while you were here, so he sent me afterwards, and I need some of the reward that you were offering him. 2 young men of the sons of the prophets of the Mount of Ephraim have need for this. Gehazi, in his mind, sees an opportunity here to line his pockets a little bit and to make himself some money. So he lied to Naaman on behalf of Elisha to try to get part of the reward. Okay, so he runs him down. Naaman sees Gehazi coming, thinks something's wrong, something's happened, so he stops the chariot, goes and meets Gehazi, and Gehazi tells him that he needs some of the reward. Verse 23, and Naaman said, be content. Take 2 talents. And he urged him, and bound 2 talents of silver in 2 bags with 2 changes of garments, and laid them upon 2 of his servants, and they bare them before him. And when he came to the tower, he took them from their hand, and bestowed them in the house, and let the men go, and they departed. So Gehazi then Naaman sends the reward back with a couple of his servants to help carry it. And as they get closer to where Gehazi lives, he takes this reward, takes this stolen money, essentially, this lied about deceitful money, and clothes and things from the servants, and takes them into his house. Now, before we get any further into this, what did Gehazi's deceitful scheme here that he had, what does it say about his faith in God? Very shallow, right? He did not have the same faith that Elisha had, right? Now, Gehazi has been with Elisha probably for quite some time, right? He's probably his right-hand man, helps him do a lot of stuff. Is it probably safe to assume that Gehazi has seen Elisha do some pretty incredible things in the name of God? I think it is. I think it's pretty safe to say that he has seen Elisha do some of these miracles. We just watched Naaman be cured of leprosy, right? He probably was around when Elisha fixed the water in Jericho. He probably was around when the guy came with the food and Elisha blessed the food and fed everybody. Gehazi was there for that, saw all these things taken care of, and had been under the tutelage and learning from Elisha for probably several years, and had probably seen evidence over and over and over of God taking care of the needs of Elisha and of his people. But he still yet did not have the faith in God to provide for his every single need. Gehazi saw an opportunity which he could care for himself to make sure he was a little better off, and he was willing to disobey God to provide for himself. And when Gehazi returns to Elisha, he actually lies some more to conceal his behavior. Verse 25. And when he went in and stood before his master, and Elisha said unto him, Whence comest thou, Gehazi? And he said, Thy servant went no whither. And he said unto him, Went not mine heart with thee, when the man turned again from his chariot to meet thee? Is it a time to receive money, to receive garments, and olive yards, and vineyards, and sheep, and oxen, and men servants, and maidservants? And the leprosy thereof Naaman shall cleave unto thee, and unto thy seed forever. And he went out from his presence as a leper, white as snow. So Gehazi returns back to Elisha, lies to Elisha about where he'd been and what he'd done, and lies again. But the Lord had already revealed Gehazi's devious, deceitful plan unto Elisha. Had already revealed it to him. So when Elisha essentially gave him the opportunity there in verse 26 to come clean, he doesn't. He tries to cover up with another lie. And as a result of that, we see in verse 27 that because of his covetous behavior, because of his deceit, and because of his disobedience to God, what happens to Gehazi? He ends up with what? The leprosy that Naaman had, right? He ends up with the leprosy that Naaman had. Now, Jesus informed us that in the days of Elisha, that many had leprosy. But no one except Naaman of Syria was healed of that leprosy. Let's go to Luke with me, please. Luke chapter 4. And look at verse 27. And this is Christ speaking here in verse 27 of chapter 4 of Luke. He says, "And many lepers were in Israel in the time of Elisha the prophet." What's the next phrase? "And none of them were cleansed, except who? Save Naaman the Syrian." Okay, so Christ now, thousands of years later, right, mentions and refers back to this point. That there was none that was cured of their, not even Gehazi, right? Gehazi obviously fell ill and died of his leprosy. All right. Now we see the correlation here in 2 Kings and Christ bringing that back because it's a testament to the help that we have as Christians. It is a testament to the help that Israel has available to them as well if you simply turn to God just like Naaman did. Because of Naaman's faith in God, he was the only leper ever cured of leprosy during this time. That power is the same power that the Israelites have. It's the same power as we as Christians have when we turn and are obedient to Him. So we see faith brought by recuperation in 2 Kings chapter 5. Now we're going to finish this up by looking at chapter 6 and see faith brought by recovery. Okay? And so let's go to chapter 6 and let's look at the first 7 verses here. Now we're going to another episode here of Elisha performing another miracle. This time we kind of go back to this school of prophets in which we have seen now a couple of times. And this school of prophets is growing. There's more people being involved with it. People are learning. And it's all because of Elisha's effective ministry. Okay? And because this is growing, obviously when schools or places grow, there's got to be stuff built, right? So more people can live there, more people can stay there, and that's kind of what we see going on here. Go to chapter 6, verse 1, and let's read down through verse 4. And the sons of the prophet said unto Elisha, "Behold, now the place where we dwell with thee is too strait for us. Let us go, we pray thee, unto the Jordan, and take thence every man a beam, and let us make a place there where we may dwell." And he answered and said, "Go ye." And one said, "Be content, I pray thee, and go with thy servants." And he answered, "I will go." So he went with them, and they came to the Jordan. They cut down wood. So we see the students here of this school needing a place to stay. There's so many of them there that there's not enough room for them all. So they come to Elisha and said, "We want to build more places for us to stay. I'm going to go down to the Jordan River and cut some wood to help them build some places, build more dorms or houses, whatever, kind of however you want to look at it." And Elisha tells them to go ahead and do that. And they ask Elisha to help as well, and he agrees to help them. Okay? Now, so they're going down to the Jordan River, going to go cut some logs down, trees down to build for lumber, to build a place for them to stay, because this ministry of Elisha is being very effective. The school of the prophets is increasing, so we kind of see the need that is here. All right, verse 5. "But as one was felling a beam, the axe head fell into the water, and he cried and said, Alas, master, for it was borrowed." So we see now, as he's cutting the tree down, what happens to the axe? It goes flying off the handle. Probably at some point you've had this happen to you. Either axe fly off or top of the hammer fly off or something. You've all been there before. So this old boy's just chopping a tree down. I'm sure as he's taking it back this way to strike the tree again, the axe head just goes flying off of it, flies into the Jordan River, and it's gone. And he has a concern here because the axe head was what? It wasn't his, it was borrowed, right? Somebody had loaned this to him and had allowed him to use it. All right, so as he's cutting this down, it flies off, and he's worried. Now, during this time, according to the law, the student who borrowed the axe would have been responsible to place the axe. Okay, and most likely this was a young man who had very little money of building or even purchasing another axe to replace the one that he had just lost. So we see in verse 6, we kind of see the response. Now, so this axe is gone. The guy has no way of getting it back. The law says he has to replace it. So he is concerned. Get to verse 6. And the man of God said, "Where fell it?" And he showed him the place. And Elisha here, he cut down a stick, cast it in thither, and the iron did swim. And he said, "Take it up to thee." And he put it out his hand, and he took it. So now we see Elisha coming over to asking the young man, "Show me where it went in." Now, what do we know, just common knowledge, about iron and silver and heavy metals? What do? They sink, right? Instantly, right? As a matter of fact, most anchors are made of iron, right? Because they sink. So this axe head would have been heavy, and it would have sunk straight to the bottom of the Jordan River. Okay? Elisha comes over, cuts a stick down. And he takes the stick, and where the axe head had fallen into the river, Elisha takes the stick and he throws it somewhere in the vicinity of where that axe head entered the water. And then what does the axe head do? Floats, right? It becomes buoyant and floats to the top of the river. Now, this would have been probably pretty awesome to see. And would have been probably a pretty influential moment in this young man's life to see this kind of happening. It would be interesting for us to see as well, this iron axe head floating back to the top of the water. He then sends the young man out into the water to retrieve the axe head. Now, the axe had value to the original owner, right? That's why young man was concerned while it was gone. By faith, he was able to recover that lost value. All right? And that's the point here of this miracle, is that Elijah's faith brought about the recovery. In the days of Elisha, Israel was lost and wandering from God. But faith in God and a renewed commitment to worship and serve God could restore the value to them highly. Perhaps Elisha's miracle is here in the Scriptures for us to kind of see that point. So we see his faith brought recovery. Last one, faith bringing rescue. Let's look at verse 8. The king of Syria warred against Israel and took counsel with the servants, saying, "In such and such place shall be my camp." And the man of God sent unto the king, saying, "Beware that thou pass not such a place, for thither the Syrians are come down." And the king of Israel sent to the place which the man of God told him, and warned him, and saved himself there, not once nor twice. Now, to this point, as we've been reading through with Elisha's miracles, his miracles were performed to minister to the needs of individuals. We see Naaman, see the young man here with the axe head, and the other miracles that we've looked at as well. Okay? Next round of miracles witnesses to the entire nation of Israel as well as Syria. And these miracles are there to show that there is a God in Israel, and that Elisha was the man that was anointed by that God in Israel. Okay? So we see in verses 8, 9, and 10 here one more time, Ben-Hadad sends armies into Israel to raid them, to attack them one more time. But every time that the Syrians pitched their camp for the night, Elisha informed the king, Jehoram, that of the location where they were going to pitch their camps, so that they could set up guards against them. All right, so we see in verses 8, 9, and 10. If we go back to verse 9, the man of God sent unto the king of Israel, saying, "Beware that there pass not such a place, for thither the Syrians are come down." So he's going to tell the Israelites every time that where the Syrians are going to stop and put up camp for the night. And when this happens over and over again, obviously just as Elisha said that it would, we see in verse 11 the response. "Therefore the heart of the king of Syria was sore troubled for this thing, and he called his servants and said unto them, Will ye not show me which of us is for the king of Israel?" So he thinks that there is a traitor in the camp. Right? He thinks that there is a rat in there, a spy, telling the Israelites where they're going to show up every night. Look at verse 12. "And one of his servants said," so he's asked them, "All right, which one of you all do we know who the rat is?" Do we know who the spy is that keeps telling the Israelites where we're going to stop for the night? Verse 12. And one of his servants said, None, my lord, O king, but Elisha the prophet that is in Israel telleth the king of Israel the words that thou speakest in thy bedchamber. Ben-Hadad now had seen Elisha work a couple of different times. Right? He's seen the work of the Lord on a couple of different occasions. But it takes the servant, who probably has also seen Elisha do these works of the Lord, to explain to Ben-Hadad that this is nobody in here that's causing this. It's Elisha who is able to hear the things that you're speaking in private, because of the power that he wields through God. That's why he's able to do that. Elisha is the person that is responsible for what is going on. And verse 13 with me, please. When Ben-Hadad kind of hears of this and realizes this, he says, Go and spy where he is, that I may send and fetch him. And it was told him, saying, Behold, he is in Dothan. Therefore send he thither horses and chariots in a great host, and encamp by night, and compass the city about. And when the servant of the man of God was risen early and gone forth, behold, a host compassed the city, both with horses and chariots. And his servant said unto him, Alas, my master, how shall we do? And he answered and said, Fear not, for they that be with us are more than they that be with them. And Elisha prayed and said, Lord, I pray thee, open his eyes, that he may see. And the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw, and behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire around about Elisha. And when they came down to him, Elisha prayed unto the Lord and said, Smite this people, I pray thee, with blindness. And he smote them with blindness, according to the word of Elisha. And Elisha said unto them, This is not the way, neither is this the city. Follow me, and I will bring you to the man whom you seek. But he led them to Samaria. And it came to pass, when they were come into Samaria, that Elisha said, Lord, open the eyes of these men, that they may see. And the Lord opened their eyes and saw, and behold, they were in the midst of Samaria. And the king of Israel said unto Elisha, when he saw them, My father, shall I smite them? Shall I smite them? And he answered, Thou shalt not smite them. Wouldest thou smite those whom have taken captive with thy sword and with thy bow? Set bread and water before them, and they may eat and drink and go to their master. And he prepared great provisions for them, and they had eaten and drunk and sent them away, and they went to the master. So the bands of Syria came no more into the land of Israel. And it came to pass after this that Ben-Hadad, the king of Syria, gathered all his host and went up and besieged Samaria. So we see now that Ben-Hadad gets mad, wants to know where Elisha's at. They find out where Elisha's at. He's dwelling in Dothan. So they sent a huge force to the city to surround it, to be ready to capture Elisha as soon as he wakes up. And when Elisha's servant raises up or wakes up in the morning, he sees this army and alerts Elisha, and he's worried and he's frantic and he's concerned, and he asks what in the world they're going to do. Elisha tells him, as we saw in verse 16, that the ones that are with us, the God that is with us, is much greater than the false gods, the false people who are with the army outside of the city. So he tells this servant and comforts the servant and tells him, encourages him the Lord's people are essentially everywhere. And when Elisha prays for this young servant, the Lord enables this servant to see normally invisible heavenly forces, right? So he tells him, we saw in verse 17, he prays, open this man's eyes so you can see. And he looks and he sees these chariots of fire. He sees all these armies of the Lord kind of surrounding them, and he allows this servant to see these heavenly invisible forces. The hills around Dothan, right, were teemed, were just filled with chariots and horses of fire. God had came in response to Elisha's prayer, in response to the rescue. Elisha could see the army because he had faith in God. His servant had faith in God because he could see the army. And Elisha's faith gives evidence of what could not be seen. And when the Syrians advanced towards Elisha, he prayed that the Lord would smite the enemy with blindness. As we saw in verse 18, 19, and 20, the Lord does that. He makes them blind, leaves them blind, and drives the Syrian troops miles away, all the way down into Samaria. And then when Elisha prays for their sight to be returned, they saw that their sight was in fact returned. They could see again, and the Syrians saw that they were surrounded. And then Elisha instructs Jehoram not to kill them, but to feed them well. And then after feeding them, allowing them to eat, the embarrassed soldiers returned back to Ben-Hadad. And there was a defeat here that at the hand of Elisha because of his faith in God. So we see faith brought about by rescue. There is another instance we go in chapter 6 that we're not going to have a chance to look at. But we see that there's faith brought. The last one, faith brought by relief. When we see Ben-Hadad comes down there and he surrounds Samaria again, he's mad and upset with what's going on. And then, let's see, this is what I'm trying to get to. The last one, faith brought by relief. All this miraculous stuff is going on. This overwhelming displays of power on behalf of the people of Israel. But we see one more time that Jehoram and his people do not return back to the Lord. And they blame God for the famine and stuff that's going on. He threatens to kill Elisha as well. And in response to the upset of Jehoram, his inability to find faith in God, his anger at Elisha, Elisha tells the king's messengers that an abundance of food, the famine, we're going to be found the very next day. The messenger, this is down through the rest of chapter 6, the messenger refuses to believe the prediction, but of course it comes true. 4 starving lepers show up outside the city to surrender to the Syrians, and thinking that hopefully the Syrians would spare them, but they got to the camp. It was empty, just like Elisha told him that was going to be. Elisha's prophecies come true. God causes the Syrians to flee, and after the thought, they heard the Egyptians and the Hittites' armies are coming to Samaria's rescues. The Syrians leave. All the provisions of the camp is left there as well, and so that's where the great amount of food and thing is left, just like Elisha said it would be. And Elisha again continues to walk by faith as we see this final thing that we have here, our overall theme for Lesson 8 through all 6 of these miracles that faith brought to Elisha and to the people that Elisha involved with as well. And we see Elisha, even in the midst of all of this, even in the midst of all the power that is wielding, even in the midst of all these miracles that God's performing through him, he continues to stay faithful, continues to stay obedient unto the will of God. And because of that, God continues to provide for him. Okay, so that finishes up lesson 8. Next week we're going to get into the next lesson, which is called A Light Forever. And that took us 3 weeks to get through 2 chapters. This next lesson has us going from 2 Kings chapter 8 all the way through 2 Kings chapter 11. And it's 1, 2, and with 3 points. So we're going to be probably moving through it pretty quickly next week. But as we continue to see the life forever that is shown and has been through these divided kingdoms, and we see Elisha here continuing to walk by faith. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for the lessons of Elisha that we have, that we're able to see the importance of living a life that is honoring and is obedient to you. And even in the midst of all the things that were going on in Elisha's life, the things that were happening, predicaments that he was in as well that were oftentimes life-threatening, he still looked to you for his provision and still walked by faith. And you blessed him because of it, Lord. That should be a reminder to us as well to continue to walk by faith. We pray for Pastor Rob as he comes in the next hour, that you'll just use him in a mighty way as well. That you keep us attentive to the word that you have through him. In your name I pray.